I kind of want to ask you a very basic question here that I feel we may have skipped over for, for the lay folk out there. How are you operationalizing status? What does it mean to say that people are matching their roughly the same
Well,
status?
status. So that's an interesting question because there's lots of different aspects to status, right? So people have wealth, they have income, they have health, they have occupational status, they have educational status. And so you would think that we would end up in a world where you would find people who are very high on some measures of status and very low on other measures. But when we operate with this data, what you find is that there really seems to be almost an underlying unity of status. When we look at high status families, they end up doing all kinds of different things. I mean, some go in the military, some are in the church, some are in education. But what you actually find is that there are different paths that people achieve, but there really is, the thing that's inherited is this general tendency in whatever occupation you're going to be in to achieve a higher level of status within that occupation. And so it means that you can conveniently, at the group level, measure status either even by looking at wealth or income or occupation or education. It'll give you the same answer, essentially, as to what the status of groups is, right? Now, for individuals, there's going to be variation, but at the level of groups and families and stuff like that, we could actually think of status as essentially a single thing that somehow is transmitted from one generation to the next. And that will show up in different times, in different ways, but that essentially, however society changes, whatever become the higher status occupations, these people will end up filling those positions, right? So medicine, for example, in the 19th century had much lower status than it does now.
Right.
As soon as medicine gets higher status, then you will find the movement into these types of occupations. Finance now has become a very high status activity, very high earning activity. It's changed again the composition of who is ending up in finance. So now graduates from places like Harvard, a huge fraction of them are heading towards these activities because of that change in status. And so the finding here seems to be that again, if you take a thing like IQ, there's an idea that there's an underlying unity, that there's many different things you can measure, but there's some general level of IQ underneath this. For status, for a lot of purposes, we can think about it in that way, right? And the one that does deviate a bit is wealth, right? Because there, as I say, you could be the lucky recipient of wealth. We actually see, though, that in the long run, wealth tends to kind of adapt to status.
Yeah.
And so even within this data set, what we find in the early 19th century is that there are a lot of shocks for wealthier people to what their wealth is based on how many siblings they have, because that determines what share of the parental wealth they get. And so you see in the first generation that there are these significant wealth shocks. But what you see is that over the course of the subsequent two generations, those disparities disappear. And that eventually their wealth, that shock to wealth is gone within roughly 3 generations. And so, and it also actually has this interesting implication that when you look back now, I mean, there's been all of this idea, but what about undeserved wealth that people got in the early 19th century or the 18th century? And so one of them examples is from ownership of slaves. Based on this data, that money was spent within about 90 years of it being acquired, right? It's all gone by now, because what's actually ultimately then determining people's wealth is their status position and their occupational position. And you actually, as I say, do see this adjustment. Wealth does not perpetuate forever. It gradually dissipates in this way. So as I say, so that's why it turns out it's nice, it's convenient that you don't have to worry about the different aspects of status, that in some sense it is a package And that's what's being transmitted across generations.
Yeah, I guess some people have this perhaps critique in mind when they're hearing you describe the study of, well, you've got people who, they've got their Harvard degree and they trade off $500,000 salary at a hedge fund
Right.
for going into academia. So how could you possibly say there's this one thing called status? But I guess the simple reply there is, yeah, they'll probably go and meet someone and marry someone who may be working in a hedge
Right.
fund or may also be an academic, right? It's not necessarily a concept that you know it when you see it, but it's just kind of multi-dimensional.
Yeah, and there's an interesting case, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, there was significant discrimination against the Jewish population in the United States. And so they were excluded from places like Harvard, they were excluded from things like the medical profession. And what happened then in that circumstance is that people went into things like finance, where you can't be excluded, and did very well in this area. And so there's more elasticity to society. So even if you exclude a group from particular occupations, if you say in some places, well, you can't be part of government.
There's like
right?
an arbitrage opportunity that the market
Normally
gives
in
you.
a market economy, there's enough other possibilities.
Someone spots, we can employ the Jewish people, and they seem to be better on average.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, as I say, people are always making these trade-offs, and so as I say, it just and so it makes it more convenient, right? Because otherwise, we would be ending up in a world where we would find a whole bunch of highly educated families who have very low incomes, right? Or very low wealth, right? Because they all devoted themselves to academic life, and that's not a high-paying area. But as I say, we don't tend to observe that, right? We tend to observe that even in this lineage, within families, it's amazing the diversity of what people end up doing, right? If you look at just brothers within these families, there's very many different paths, and even within families, there's no kind of concentration on particular areas. As I say, one of the interesting illustrations of this, by the way, is that Darwin had many children, and he married a wife who was very highly educated, very talented. We know all of the descendants of Darwin, and they are very distinguished. And in fact, I think I was saying that in my academic department, on average, Darwin's descendants are more distinguished. And I was at a very good academic department at Davis in California. So they're really distinguished, but they do all kinds of different things now. And so there's some of them who are in science still, but there's a bunch of them who are in film or writing or other enterprises. But a lot of them have Wikipedia pages devoted to them. They're notable. They're making a difference.
I spent an afternoon going through all of them. Yeah, I couldn't believe the diversity. But,
right. And you get this, as I say, this diversity. And so that is just the nature of social life. It's interesting that people don't tend to really track particular occupations for very long. There's a lot of movement to different areas over time. But as I say, it makes it easier for doing research in this area, where we can just say, look, there's this thing called social status. Some people have it, other people don't have it, but it'll show up in many different ways. Right?
So I want to ask you a couple of questions from Bo and Noah, channel their presence so we get the full Aporia editorial experience. So let me get these up for you. Where are we? So Noah asks, you've said that, quote, a world where social outcomes are substantially determined at birth should push us towards compressing differences in income and wealth. Why then are progressives so hostile to the claim that social outcomes are substantially determined at birth?
As I said, that is a puzzle to me. I think because they want to imagine a world where everyone has the same chance, right? And they have an image of a world where we could set up the social structure in such a way that everyone at the starting line in kind of the race of life has the same possibilities, and that there's this kind of idealized world. And it's a little mystifying to me. I mean, anyone who has been a teacher, anyone who's had children,
Yeah, more than one.
can see that there just are enormous differences in people's talents and abilities, and that the assumption that all of this somehow was generated by their early experiences is just not plausible, right? And so I'm genuinely mystified about the degree of resistance there is to this claim, or to this possibility that there really are inherent genetic differences in the possibilities people have. I mean, because if you think about another thing, height, most people would not dispute that height is, in a modern high-income society, almost entirely genetically determined, right? And most people have no difficulties accepting that, right? And height then has consequences in terms of people's social outcomes and their possibilities in athletics and stuff like that. And most people are perfectly comfortable with the inheritance of height through genetic means. And so, as I say, it's a mystery then for them to somehow think that other kind of social competences must all be entirely kind of generated anew in each generation and can't be genetically transmitted.
Well, I imagine they simply think that, you know, even if you explained height being 0.8 and the rest of it is random noise, that there's an analogy between malnourishment stunting your growth and basically being working class, right? Working class is the analogous form of malnourishment, and so if we just made the working class people go to private school, they would be boosted.
Yes. Now, and I admit, I mean, that it is a genuine, honorable kind of instinct that people don't want to say, look, given this person's relatives, there's really a limit to how well that person is going to do in life. But one thing I think that they haven't taken on board is that even when there is kind of genetic determination of outcomes, there's still going to be very substantial randomness. And so there's still going to be, and that randomness is a form that the people at the bottom 10% of this generation, their kids on average are all going to be moving upwards, right? And the people who are going to be in the bottom 10% from the next generation are actually going to be people who get bad luck in this generation, are going to move downwards. And so I think part of it is maybe a misunderstanding, right? Where even with genetic determination, we know from studies of identical twins that there's still significant randomness in the world. But, and so that it's never going to be the case that we can look at someone and say, I've done an inventory of your relatives, and I can see the best possibility for you would be to complete basic schooling, right? And that's not going to be the case. Now, it is absolutely going to be the case that the probabilities for that person are very adverse for them actually being able to move to the top of the social ladder. And again, actually in this genealogy, what you actually see is that it's very rare for people to move from the bottom to the top. The movement you do see tends to be families that get lucky generation after generation, and in the course of 5 or 6 generations move from being the bottom of the distribution towards the top of the distribution. But those are very rare moves. And as I say, most of the people are circling somewhere around the center of the distribution. But as I say, it's hard for me to understand that, because personally it seems entirely reasonable and plausible to me. And it doesn't, to me, have these very dire social consequences that people imagine. for this, right? And so it's a, as I say, it's a surprising thing about our society, how certain perfectly reasonable scientific forms of explanation have come to be completely taboo, right? Where you're willing to just ban people from investigating this and ban people from talking about this, right? And I must say, when we were trying to raise some funding in order to construct, this was a huge effort to construct this genealogy. We applied to some, I think we ended up applying to the NSF and being put in the kind of sociology panel. And someone said something to the effect, I was honest enough to say, well, here's one of the reasons we're interested in this data, to investigate in part what the role of genetics would be. And someone wrote and said, no, we should not spend any money on any research that would not allow us to increase rates of social mobility, right? Anything spent on establishing that social mobility was somehow determined is not a thing we should spend money on. We should only spend money on processes that would show us how to increase social mobility. So that's a problem with the kind of funding of research, which is this bias is actually going to have significant impacts in terms of what research gets funded, right? And no one is interested in funding research that says that it's hard to change rates of social mobility. No one.